My name is Leif Wellington Haase. I direct the California program at the Foundation, which has been very active both in California and around the country on issues related to political reform and voters' rights. As you all know, California's innovative ballot initiative system, introduced by Governor Hiram Johnson and others at the beginning of the 20th century, and hailed by many supporters as the cutting edge of direct democracy, is now viewed in many quarters as an obstacle to democracy. At the same time, both in California and nationally, popular views of elected officials and government in general are historically grim. According to last week's CNN poll, some 86% of Americans think government is fundamentally broken, although happily only 5% of the people think that it's broken for good. At a Public Policy Institute of California poll last month found that just 30% of Californians approve of the job the governor is doing, and 17% feel the same way about the legislature. Yet at the same time, some of the more ambitious proposals slated for upcoming ballots that would increase direct popular involvement, including a constitutional convention, appear to have stalled. We're here today to talk candidly about where California's great experiment in direct democracy, the initiative process, stands. What can be improved, what can be revived, what is going wrong, and what can be salvaged. And we're fortunate to do so with a panel that includes Gale Kaufman, one of the most experienced and distinguished strategists of both initiative campaigns and political campaigns in the state. And the full bios of all the panelists are in your packet. Gale is perhaps best known for her work leading the alliance that opposed the governor's ballot measures in 2005. And we're also going to focus on the future of the initiative and direct democracy in international context. In that respect, we're deeply privileged to be joined by Swiss-born democracy expert Bruno Kaufmann, one of the most prominent figures on the European political reform scene. Kaufmann, a journalist by profession, was the founding director of Initiative Referendum Europe and has authored a number of books on modern direct democracy. He'll be hosting one of the world's foremost gatherings of democracy experts, the Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy, in San Francisco this summer. I should also say Switzerland, Bruno's birthplace, is home to one of the most ambitious forms of direct democracy on the planet, which combines simultaneous referenda with federal and municipal elections conducted on the basis of proportional representation. This system appears to work for a country that's far more regionally and linguistically diverse than many preconceptions of it in the West. It's not by accident that George Bernard Shaw said his rank was the highest known in Switzerland, that of a free citizen. And perhaps we could justly say that democracy is as American as Chevrolet. That would be Louis Chevrolet, born and raised in Le Chaux-de-Fonds, Canton Neuchâtel, Switzerland. Finally, I'd like to call on my extraordinary colleague, Joe Mathews, formerly the political correspondent for the LA Times, the author of a biography of Governor Schwarzenegger, a prolific writer and blogger, including the blockbuster democracy site that tracks initiatives in the state, and co-author with Mark Paul of the forthcoming book, The California Crack-Up, to moderate this panel. Joe?
I think I may need that. I hope this works and you can hear me well. Thank you for coming. This is event is a bit of an experiment and a preview. It's very much a comparative exercise. I've been the great beneficiary of the wisdom of both of these two folks who, as far as we know, are not related, though we may get Skip Gates and one of these DNA things on that after the event, in very different contexts, but essentially as a reporter. And I thought it would be interesting to bring together sort of the most expert person I know of in California on direct democracy and the top strategist. Please don't anyone tell Mr. Clausen or any of the others I just said that. And this global expert, Bruno, who I got to know first as a reporter, as I looked for ways to sort of compare California, its model and its methods, the strange way we do things, the stranger it looks from a global perspective, as we may soon learn a little bit of the hint here, with other systems both around the country and around the world. And so my hope is that they'll be fairly brief in the remarks. So we have some very much get a little bit into the weeds of direct democracy from signature gathering on up, and really compare methods and models across the world with a heavy emphasis on California and Switzerland, which are sort of the world leaders, at least in doing a lot of this for a very long time. With that brief introduction, and I guess I should explain, this is a preview of what you may see this summer. Bruno and I have been driving around and flying around the country for the last week and a half, trying to organize a global conference which will be at UC Hastings in San Francisco, July 31st through August 4th, the 2010 Global Forum on Modern Direct Democracy. And we expect people from 40 countries, more than half the U.S. states, to be there, academics, journalists, activists, political professionals who are engaged in Initiative Referendum and other direct democratic models, some citizens' juries and that sort of thing in their home country, state, city. But let's get this rolling. I want to start with sort of get a little bit of an assessment from each and an overview, and I'll start with Gale and sort of ask her to talk a little bit about kind of the state of the initiative process here in California, with a little bit of perspective, strengths and weaknesses, and also maybe a few ways it's changed in her time, working in initiative campaigns.
Are we sitting here?
I think, yeah.
You can hear me okay? Okay, good. Well, good afternoon. I just have to say that I think there are two reasons I got invited. One, because my last name was Kaufman, and I'm the only Kaufman that Joe knew, so boy, what a lucky break for me. And two, when he called, I said, "You've got to be kidding. I've read a few of Bruno's articles. He's really thoughtful and smart, and I'm neither of those. I'm, a political hack. I run the campaigns for a bunch of initiatives, so it may be an interesting contrast. I'll try and do the Kaufman name justice. In answer to kind of where I think things are, I pulled two articles for just this past weekend, both out of the same newspaper. Chief Justice says initiatives paralyze state. That would have been Saturday. And A Sign of California's Dysfunction by John Diaz on the editorial page of the Chronicle from Sunday. So I think things are great. I think everything could be better from someone who runs campaigns. It's great. I think no one would suggest that things are going exactly as to plan, but you could start all the way with the national scene and move your way to California. If you look at what happened with initiatives, you see some strengths and you see some weaknesses. At this very moment, I think there are somewhere between 7 and 9 initiatives that if you went to your local Target store, you might be able to sign petitions for. Now, I say that to start because there were over 100 initiatives filed with the Attorney General's office and the Secretary of State within the time period by which you would qualify for November. So there was something, if you follow California politics, about 3 or 4 months ago, you could pull the articles that say there's going to be a war on the street, there's going to be Armageddon, everybody under the sun has introduced an initiative, labor and business are going to be killing each other. I could go on. And yet, I had my office do a little random check of the last number of cycles. There's usually about 2 to 4 initiatives that make it onto the June ballot, and somewhere between 10 and 14 that make it to the November ballot. And given where we are and the time frame it takes to qualify an initiative, we're pretty much as we normally are. Somewhere around probably 10 or so will qualify for November. So all the doom and gloom and craziness that seemed like it might go on may not. It did feel for a moment like there's an adage in our business that if you have $200, you too can qualify or submit an initiative, and a lot of people seem to have $200 this year. So they did at least do that part. But it costs a whole lot more to get to the ballot, and I know we will discuss that further. basically, why the dysfunction? Why is the Chief Justice saying things are broken? I think because people don't pay a lot of attention thinking about initiatives, to be honest with you. I do more focus groups than any one human being really should do, and I listen to voters a lot, and I find a couple of interesting things. Voters in California believe strongly in the initiative process. They want the ability to be able to vote on things that are put on the ballot. Have they thought long and hard about how they got there, how much it cost? Were they special interests? Were they not? No. But once it gets to the ballot, if they're going to vote, they want to be thoughtful about it, and they do, to a greater degree than you would believe, spend time reading the ballot arguments, sometimes even reading beyond the ballot arguments, going online and trying to be thoughtful about the initiatives that are put on the ballot. They hate the commercials, but they hear the commercials, and they try and contrast it with some amount of material. Not everybody, but a good number. Two, if you suggest changing the initiative process, which I've done a lot of asking about, they're very skeptical of that, and they're very cynical about it. But they also don't understand it. They believe more than not, I think if you did a poll, you'd still see this was the case. We did it a number of years ago, that most initiatives are vetted much more than they are. And what I mean by that is voters don't recognize that if a lawyer, they think lawyers write these things, and they're put together by people who've already checked to see, are they constitutional? Do they meet all the tests of legality, so that when if you vote yes and they pass, they are sometimes, sent into court at like 187, some other numbers I could throw out there that might be meaningful to you. Voters get mad if they find out afterwards that something they voted on was pulled back by a court, because they don't understand that in our process, there is nothing that checks them out ahead of time and says, boy, this is going to be unconstitutional. They get the signatures, and nobody challenges it before it goes on the ballot. It's only afterwards that process occurs. And we changed the process in the 60s, which used to do a little more vetting than there is now. So voters are unhappy about that, but they don't really understand it. And I'll just finish my comments for now in terms of what I think does and doesn't work about the process. I've heard ad nauseum, that the fact that we use paid signature gatherers and only special interests can pay for them, and isn't that terrible? And I could have a long conversation with you about the merits of it. I've worked with it, but more times than not, coming from the Democratic side of the equation, when I put something together with my clients and we go to the street to start to collect signatures, we have a volunteer component. It's getting more sophisticated with the internet, but we've been doing it that way for a long time. It's messy. Democracy is messy. Getting voters who are really registered to vote where they say, and all the things you have to go through in order to make sure that the petition is legal and really you're getting qualified signatures is more difficult than you know. And you may remember that an initiative I was recently associated with, the most recent attempt at term limits. We came very close to not qualifying that petition. That's the first time that ever happened to me. I did a lot of work after that to try and figure out why. And that's because a lot of people move, a lot of people think they're registered who sign. We used a lot of volunteers for some of that work, and a lot of them were not valid signatures. So when everything is said and done, and I appreciate more than you know how expensive it is to qualify something. Do I think that's icky? Yeah, I wish it was cheaper. But only 5% of voters are required to sign a petition. In this big state, that's all that you need. You need 5% of registered voters for a statute and 8% for a constitutional amendment to California Constitution. That's a pretty small number if you think about it. We have 5 months to do that. That seems like a significant amount of time if you think about it. So that's the law as it sits now. And I will tell you, I'm not sure that voters would be all that crazy about changing much about that law anytime real soon.
Thank you very much, Gale. A very narrow question before we go to Bruno. This is a lot. You talk to voters all the time and hear from voters in focus groups, and there are a lot of voters in the state who are immigrants. Do people ever bring up, I'm curious to know, experiences with referenda, for example, and wherever they've come from? Does that ever pop up in a conversation in these sorts of things?
Rarely.
Very rare.
Rarely.
Fair enough. Next we have Bruno, and I think to move this along and keep this going quickly, I'll briefly introduce him personally. I was going to ask him a little bit about his story, and I think you might want to come up here so you'll be with your laptop. But Bruno is born in Switzerland, grew up there. I think being Swiss makes you something of a Democrat because you're asked to vote so often. Was an initiative sponsor himself of an initiative that did not pass to abolish the Swiss Army. I think in part because he was a very unhappy Swiss soldier. And married a Swedish woman, lives in Sweden, where he is a journalist, a radio journalist, also for newspapers, for Swiss National Radio, and also a political scientist, as president of the Initiative Referendum Europe, which is at the University of Marburg, Germany. And he's also a bit of an activist, a globetrotter, just spent 6 months traveling around Asia, and is a sort of a Johnny Appleseed particularly of local direct democracy, though that is not a reference he gets or understands, or that I've been able to sufficiently explain to him. But I want to ask you, though, to sort of, jumping off from what Gale has told us about the state of the process, talk a little bit about how big, how alone are we in the world here in California? What has been the spread of it, and how does California fit or not fit into sort of models of global direct democracy?
Yes, thank you very much, Joe. You're not alone. I'm very happy also to be here finally in the heartland of direct democracy in the United States. I'm also happy to be together with Gale Kaufman here. I have more than 40 cousins, so I'm never sure where they are coming up. I was a little bit unsure when I touched down for the first time last week in Washington, the country, because the immigration officer asked me, "What are you doing here?" And I said, "Yeah, I'm here to work on direct democracy." And he looked at me and said,
"Go away.
Do you think we are a democracy? We are a republic." So, but then I met Joe and we had all these meetings, and finally we are here where really, obviously, direct democracy plays an important role. And when I was, as Joe has said, I've been involved in many initiatives in Switzerland and other countries as well. The issue when we talked about that outside Switzerland was never the issue like, an army, and people didn't even know that Switzerland has an army. So they always asked about the process, and were very interested in that. And that was the same time when the European Union started to become more like a polity. And today, if there would have been still the Concorde flying over the Atlantic and the continent, I would maybe have been in Brussels as well, because today there was a big hearing in the European Union about European Citizen Initiative. This will be the first transnational direct democratic right to be introduced under the new constitution, which will give 1 million people from at least 9 countries the same right as the parliament and the member states have, namely to put an issue on the legislative agenda of the European Union. And this will create a lot of dynamics regarding direct democracy in Europe. Just think about 500 million people having the right to sign initiatives at every moment of the day. I will come back to that. But the question you have had is California something like a total exotic state in the world regarding direct democracy? And it's a little bit similar when we had this discussion in Switzerland. Switzerland also, for a very long time, people thought we are the only ones to really use this process. And I would like to give you a little overview about that and start with a little world map on that. Here on this map, we have in fact done, with my institute and partners, an assessment of the constitution and legislations all around the world to see where do you have elements of direct democracy on the national, regional, and local level. And this map gives you this overview. Basically, you see that the dark colored countries do have the process on the national level, the gray ones only on the state or subnational level, and the white ones doesn't have at all something. But this map gives you a picture that 9 out of 10 countries worldwide do have some elements of direct democracy. So it's not at all like that there is nothing like that around the world. But the issue is, of course, not only the procedures at hand, but also the practices. And in most cases, that must be said, the procedures doesn't work, there is little practice. So going in a little bit into the history of direct democracy, it's indeed not a Swiss invention, as some people in Switzerland tends to believe. And it's not a Californian invention neither. I mean, the first constitutional referendums were, in fact, up to my knowledge, in the 16th century in Massachusetts. And then we had the French Revolution introducing the concept of the citizen initiative. But in fact, it was in Switzerland where this process really came together with a modern state after the foundation of the Swiss state in 1848. You had the constitutional referendum, you had the constitutional initiative, and you had a federal system where you had the system also in all states and municipalities. And out from there, in fact, there were the exchange between Switzerland and emigrants to the US and interested people in this part of the world, which inspired people in Oregon, in California, to introduce this process 100 years ago. But from there, we have seen a very interesting spread of the idea and the concept of direct democracy. For instance, when Australia became an independent state in 1901, you had both the idea of the federal state from the United States and the direct democratic constitutional referendum on the national level from Switzerland, which is still a very important feature of Australian politics. And furthermore, there were emigrants to Latin America, where the Uruguayan state introduced basically the same system as in Switzerland and in California in the 1930s. And furthermore, also to the east, where, for instance, Taiwan, as an interesting case, do have direct democracy, because, and that was a really interesting story, that the people who basically wrote the Taiwanese constitution, which is the national Chinese constitution, they were living in Oregon, and from Oregon they went to Hawaii, and there they wrote their first constitution, which became the national constitution of China, and afterwards the constitution of Taiwan. So I always ask them, why do you have initiative and referendum in your constitution? You see that is an example where the idea of the direct democracy came around the world, and since 5 years ago there is also legislation and practice for direct democracy in this part of the world. And furthermore, you know, all in these regions where you had these initial countries with the practice of direct democracy, this has also spread to other states, like 24 states of the United States, like many countries around Europe. Basically, all European countries today do have some forms of initiative and referendum, and also Latin America introduced basically all countries 20 years ago some forms of initiative and referendum, and finally also in Asia there is a lot of move towards this direction. And basically it's of course about the history of democracy is always the history of democratizing democracy. Democracy is not something which is ended, even so, and this was maybe something I heard very many times during the last 10 days here in the US, that when there is a discussion about reform, many times the discussion is ended by saying the founding fathers said it like that. And then I'm always a little bit surprised, is it really the end of the history when something has been invented 200 years ago? So today we have a world of, you can say, direct democratic procedures all over the world, but a growing number of countries where you also have practices. And in most cases, you can see that the reference to countries like Switzerland, but even more, I would say, California, is always made. And how are these references made? They are basically only made in a negative way. That means that you hear only negative things, both about Swiss case and the Californian case, and that has to do with, of course, problematic decisions at some point, maybe conflicts between the direct democracy system and other parts of a representative democracy. But basically, when we had, for instance, now the discussion in Europe about European Citizen Initiative, the Economist had a big opinion piece and asked, do we want to become Europe a big California? And that's the question, if we want to do that or not. But it's also showing you a little bit the problem that those who are using this process are very unused to tell others how it works, and those who use it at a certain other point, they try always to reinvent the wheel of direct democracy. And I think today, in a time of global communication, of global interchange, of global economy, it makes really sense to learn from each another and to see which things could be a little bit improved. And Gale has already introduced an issue like, I think is very important, for instance, the time, how much time you have for signature gathering and how high the thresholds are. There are many of these issues and we will discuss them, but I think it's really today the time of trying to maybe mainstream the good best practice of direct democracy. And in Europe, this has been made, for instance, by the Council of Europe, which has introduced the recommendations how to use this process in all member states of the European Union. So far for the introduction.
Thank you. Thanks, Bruno. I want to follow up on two specific points and then get into sort of a comparative lightning round here before we get to the Q&A. But you mentioned the European Citizens Initiative, and that, I'm not sure, has gotten a lot of attention in American media. I saw some puzzled looks. What is that? I know there was a new constitution that came into being in the EU with the passage of the Lisbon Treaty, took effect December 1st of last year. What kind of initiative is this? How would it work, and when would it start?
Yes, I mean, Europe is a strange political body, as you may know. President Obama don't even go to the US-Europe summit this spring because he still doesn't know who is the counterpart of him. So it's a big difference regarding the political system between Europe and the US. But still, there are developments in Europe which are highly interesting, I would say, that there has been in the last 10 years a change of the idea of just having an international community to become a transnational democracy. And one big element of this transnational European democracy is the notion that the European representative democracy is based both on the classical indirect parliamentarian pillar and the participative direct pillar. So the European Constitution establishes in Article 11 now the principle of that the citizens have a direct say on the European legislation, which means that the European citizens get the same right as the European Parliament and the member states have regarding to propose to the European Commission, which is a mixture of an administrative and a governmental executive body, to propose them new legislation. And this will create the right for 0.2% of the European citizens to gather at least 1 million signatures from at least 9 countries. There are 27 countries currently, and to do that both on paper but also electronically. And especially the second part, to be able to gather signatures electronically, is a new thing all over the world. There is no place in the world where you today, on a legal basis, are allowed to gather signatures electronically, and I think this will create enormous need of innovation, legal, technical, and political innovation, and it will also create a new idea of that the European citizens are not just citizens by being member state citizens, but also to be real European citizens on the transnational level. And this, I think, will create also a new way of interaction on the European level, because until now it has been limited to basically lobbying organizations in Brussels. There are 14,000 lobbyists in Brussels. So we really think that this could improve European democracy.
So organizing across 9 countries, getting 1 million signatures, you can introduce legislation yourself, directly the citizens. So I'm going to do sort of a comparative exercise, and we may get into sort of the details of direct democracy and how ballot measures work. And for the purposes of this comparison, we'll I'm going to ask Gale to sort of explain how it works in California, and Bruno to explain a little bit of a global perspective. I think for the the interest of a healthy comparison, we'll sort of focus a little on Switzerland, which has the most developed sort of direct democracy in the rest of the world. So the question to both of you, when you file, when I have an idea, I'm a citizen and I want to file, the process just very briefly in California is?
If I have an idea, I file that idea in a legal document with the Secretary of State. There's a process that both the Attorney General and the legislative analyst take a look at what you have proposed, and that's all they do. They take a look. They don't say, as I said earlier, they don't judge it in any way. But the legislative analyst, if there's a fiscal component to it, which most things have, they will analyze it for its impact on the state or local, really the state fiscal situation. So they'll write something, and that becomes a part of your actual petition, and then what goes on the ballot and says, if this passes, this could have this impact on the budget. And then they'll do something that's very important, which is the Attorney General will take your whole initiative, however millions of words it is, and reduce it down to a 100-word statement. That's what you've seen. There's been some arguing back and forth on the validity of how that's done, but that's what we look at as political consultants right away. That's called the title and summary. And that's what actually voters will read if they read nothing else. So it takes the whole thing, reduces it down. Then they put that out publicly after 45 days, and then you print the initiatives with that information on them, and you're able to go secure signatures. You have a 5-month window to do that, and then you bring them back. They check to see if all the signatures are valid in the different counties. If it is, then it's ready to go to the ballot, and it'll go on the very next ballot that you've made it valid for.
With paid signature gatherers, of course, is
most of the time, yeah. The most people use paid signatures at the moment. The going rate on the street is 70 cents for this signature round. 70 cents a signature. And I could go into more detail about that, but pretty much right now, if you have a statute that's out there, you're going to be spending somewhere between $1.5 million and $2 million to qualify it. And if you've got a constitutional amendment, it'll be more than that.
Bruno, briefly, what's different if you were to do this in Switzerland or sort of the European model countries? What would be different about that process?
I mean, the process of initiative making in Switzerland, you can file it up into 18 different phases. So let's stick to this filing element. I mean, basically in Switzerland, the popular initiative on the national level is only about constitutional amendments. You cannot do statutory initiatives. You can do that on the state level and on the local level. But on the national level, only constitutional amendments. And this creates, is done in a way that you have to have a committee of at least 7 people who file a text. And this text should be a concrete law amendment, an amendment for the Constitution, or just a general direction of it. But normally people stick to the concrete thing because you want to have that realized. And when you do that, you go to the Secretary of State of Switzerland and also try to present that. And the thing in Switzerland is you have to translate that from the very beginning into the 4 national languages, which are German, French, Italian, and Rhetor-Roman, and this creates a huge impact on the briefness, on the clarity of this text. So if something is unclear, it will have no chance at all to be signed and to come to the ballot box. So basically, in the very beginning, together with a team of language specialists, which are also in charge, of course, of all legislation texts, Switzerland's, you will find out how a text can be filed, which is normally very short. The title can be set by the initiators themselves, and when this initiative is filed, there are 3 criteria which makes it valid or not for the signature gathering. One is the unity of the subject. You cannot put different things in one initiative. One is the unity of form. I already said it must be a specific form of a text for an amendment, or it must be a general wish. And thirdly, it is not allowed to violate binding international law. There is a big debate about that. Maybe we can discuss a little bit later. You may recall the Minaret initiative, banning of minarets in Switzerland recently. But when you have filed it, when it is registered and published, you have 18 months to gather 100,000 signatures all over the country, which is basically, I mean, I don't know many cases where there have been paid signature gatherers for that.
It's not illegal, but it's just not done, essentially?
It's not done. I mean, it's not done also because you can very much easily spread the initiative forms. You can send it by email, you can send it by internet, by post, whatsoever, and it will go back to your municipality for a verification and then to the national state of secretary. So
you have 18 months versus 150 days here too, so speed is not as essence.
Yes, the 18 months phase is very important in order to create an idea about, obviously initiatives often target problems and they propose a solution. But this solution is often very radical or far-reaching. And the big thing in Switzerland then is that the parliament can make a counter-proposal to this initiative.
Well, I think that's the next question. What's the legislative role in this? In California?
In terms of
an initiative, what power does the legislature have to weigh in?
They have none. You can see sometimes, and it happens more than not recently, they have none directly. In other words, if something gets filed, they can't change it. That was one of the criticisms, in fact, of this article I was referencing earlier about Supreme Court Justice George saying that there is a problem. There are other states that actually allow the legislature for a period of time, once something gets filed, to look at it. And if they don't do something like it or exactly like it, then it goes to the people. I've often thought that actually might have a little resonance out here, but nobody's proposed it up until now that I could find. But so for now, the legislature can do nothing other than if something gets filed, they see it gets filed, and they're interested in passing it ahead of that, they obviously can do that. And that would obviously stop the petition gathering, and the issue would pass. I can't think of too many times when that has occurred, but I can think of 1 or 2 examples. In fact, my clients were a party to at least one case where there was a funding issue involved related to education, and the legislature did see that this was going to move forward and acted on something similar enough that we stopped the signature gathering. But
specifically, when was that?
It was 4 or 5 years ago. But that doesn't happen too often. At the moment, California Forward has put together 2 initiatives that they have submitted. I am aware that they are currently speaking with both houses, trying to see if they can get the legislature to consider passing what they've put forward as pretty broad reforms, both on the budget and on some funding issues. The difficulty with that is twofold. One, the beauty of if the legislature were to do it, if they were to pass these and put them on the ballot, they could take them as a constitutional revision. Only the legislature can put on the ballot a constitutional revision, which would mean more than one subject at a time in one initiative. Currently, the California Forward proposals had to be put on the ballot separate, or go to the street separately, I'm confusing myself, because they were, in fact, not single subjects. And we do have the single subject issue as well in California. So you have to be very careful that you don't put things together in an initiative that cover more than one subject. That's the only other way, and, I'm sorry, because they're constitutional amendments, it would require a 2/3 vote. And as we know, if you follow California politics, getting this legislature to do too many things with the 2/3 vote is virtually impossible. So that's where we are.
What's the legislative role in the Swiss system?
The Swiss system does create an initiative process which takes normally quite some time. I have said 18 months of gathering time, but then the proposal goes to the legislator, first to the government, in fact, to make an advice.
Once you have the signatures, it goes there,
it goes to the government, which makes a report on it, and also all possible implications and recommendations. And then the legislator, which are two chambers, the Senate and the Congress in Switzerland, have to discuss it, and they have the right to come up with a counter-proposal, which means, for instance, we had an initiative, so-called Solar Initiative, which was very much into solar energy, that the country should promote a lot of that and leave fossil energy sources. And this initiative was seen as too radical by the legislator, so they come up with a counter-proposal which was about introducing new taxes on fossil energies, which was seen as a way into the same direction. And at the ballot box in the end, people could vote both on the initiative, on the counter-proposal of the legislator, and finally also on a third question. If both of these proposals would pass, and for passing you need a majority of the people plus a majority of the states, a majority of the people in the states.
So there are 26 cantons. Does that mean you need 14 of the states?
13. It's 25. So you need this double majority, and this created then the case that, in fact, both initiatives, the initiative and the counter-proposal, passed, and finally the people voted also on the so-called decisive question, which was then in fact in favor of the counter-proposal. So this shows you a little bit of the process, that the initiative process in a way creates much more of a dialogue between the people and the legislator plays a role in finding out which should be the best solution.
So I understand that's sort of a standard. Could the legislature accept the proposal and then just it becomes law? Is that possible?
No. When you have registered and filed and successfully delivered these 100,000 signatures, which are verified, basically only the initiative committee, these 7 people or more which have been in initiative committee, they are the responsible actors for this initiative, so they have the right to withdraw the initiative or not. And when it comes to counter-proposals, very often one can say the initiative would redraw the initiatives because they are happy with it. But it can also happen that basically the legislator fulfill all these wishes and the initiative is still going to the ballot.
And is that the sort of standard of a ballot, 3 questions? They qualify the initiative, there's a legislative counter-proposal next to it, and then there's a third question. If both of these pass, which do you prefer? Is that sort of the standard right together on the Swiss ballot?
It's not a normal case. I would say 1 out of 5 you have this case. In the other cases, you would see that the initiative goes to the ballot. We have now on March 7 an initiative which requires the introduction of animal protection attorneys in each of the states.
The animals would get lawyers?
Yes, a state attorney for animal protection, and where the parliament and the government have said this is unnecessary, we don't want that, so do you recommend the people to vote that down?
Well, I had a few more, but it's 1 o'clock, and I think by this point we want to get into questions from the audience, and I think some of the comparative stuff may probably come out in the Q&A. So the Claudia Bustamante, who I should have thanked along with Liz Wu and Lee, the folks who really put together this event for New America, thank you, has got microphones, and feel free to have out these 2 people and with your questions.
Hi, Bruno. Thanks for coming. It's fascinating to hear from you. I'm wondering if you can compare and contrast how ballot measure campaigns are financed in the rest of the world with the way that we do them in California, which is basically anybody can spend as much as they want. Managers of corporations can spend their shareholders' money on them if they want to. Is that the way it is done in most places, or are there rules or restrictions on how ballot measure campaigns, and I guess the qualification process, although it sounds like that's less of an issue, at least in Switzerland. So the campaign piece, what's the funding like?
Yeah, it's a big issue, and it's a growing issue The thing in Switzerland, for instance, is there is no disclosure at all. Because it hasn't been a big issue for a long time. There hasn't been so much money into it, but since about 20 years ago, we have some very rich people which have been very active in politics, and this was especially starting when Switzerland, after the Cold War, started to come closer to the European Union. And we have had about 10 popular votes, referendums on European Union issues, and this has created a strong, you can say, impetus from people who are afraid that Switzerland will give up its sovereignty and its independence, and they came up with a lot of money to many different initiatives, and basically this has created an imbalance, you can say, in the use and the availability of money in the process. And there's a lot of discussion about this issue of disclosure, but as you know, finance secrecy has been something like a constituting issue in Switzerland, and Switzerland is currently very much in the media and also in the headlines about these issues, not at least in relation to the US and all these bank secrecy things. So there is something like a big problem there in Switzerland. We have many other countries in Europe which this is handled totally different. In Sweden, where I'm living, I'm also a citizen there. When there is a referendum on, for instance, the introduction of the euro, we had, in fact, the parliament giving the same amount of money, even more, to those who were on the other side, in order to enable them to a little bit balance the money of the big business. So in Sweden, normally the parliament would allocate money to both sides in a campaign, in a referendum, to handle that, and there would be clear disclosure rules. Even more in Britain, they have in fact such a book about disclosure in referendums. They have a referendum commission. The problem is they have never a referendum. So there are rules at place for something which obviously doesn't happen. But I think it's all about disclosure. And obviously the limitations, I mean, the British model, which would create enormous limitations to how much money you can spend. My question is always, how do you sanction such a thing? How do you control such a thing? And what would it lead to that you have enormous, like police forces trying to control the process? But I know you have much more experience in this country. But in Europe, basically, I would say the big step forward would be much more disclosure, and especially in Switzerland. And the question now, of course, is when you have the European Citizen Initiative, this is heavily discussed. How much disclosure would these initiatives have to have in order to show who are and which forces are behind?
Other questions?
This one's directed to Gale. I'm a product of the California education system, so I was raised with the notion that initiatives were established in California out of a frustration that the public had that it couldn't get legislators, representative democracy, to enact the kinds of policy changes that the public wanted. But now it seems like special interests actually use initiatives equally or more as ways to keep or frustrate the public from taking certain kinds of actions. The PG&E initiative that's being circulated for qualification on the ballot might be an example of that kind of strategy. As a strategist, therefore, my question is, how much has the original purpose of initiatives in California been lost to this sort of alternative strategy?
Well, you know, I thought about that given the topic today, and I've read a lot of the arguing back and forth. There's a little bit of all of it if you look at it. I mean, last year the legislature put a series of initiatives on the ballot that they felt compelled to do related to the budget. They lost them all. So that was the legislature taking certain issues that they needed to take to the ballot, and voters saying, you know what, I mean, I think using their vote to say, you really need to do your job, stop making us try and do your job. That's what I think came out of that. So was there a purpose behind all of that? Well, they had to go to the ballot with those things. I think voters were very clear in what they said. I'm working against the PG&E initiative at the moment, so I'm very familiar with the one you're talking about. Yes, that's a very singular initiative paid for by only one special interest group, so I can see your question about is that a good use of the initiative process? It may or may not be. I think you can argue about the money that's spent, but if people pay attention and read our ballot argument, basically, I think it'll have a good, I think it's a good attempt to see if one special interest group will be successful. If you look at the last couple of cycles, really, folks with a lot of money and really one-issue initiatives have by and large failed because voters see through them. They know who's on both sides. Disclosure is required in terms of who's paying for the initiatives. And that process, at least, with people who pay attention, if you remember what I said to begin with, I do think more voters than not actually gets a lot of those things sorted out for them if they're going to bother to vote on these initiatives. So if there's special interest in particular, usually that comes to the light. Is that a distortion of the process? I think that's a much bigger, longer debate. But right now, I think that 100 initiatives I mentioned, there's some number of them that are kind of social action. There's some number of those that are fiscal. And there's some number of them I can't even tell you what they're all about and how they got put together. But in them was the Constitutional Convention, which was a huge reform discussion. In them were other major reforms of the process. And in them were 4 or 5, including term limits and the 2/3 vote threshold for the budget, that have been on the ballot before and, are pretty broad, reform-minded initiatives.
For both speakers, in Europe or in Switzerland, what level of judicial review is there of ballot measures, and can it be before the ballot actually makes it, or the initiative makes it to the ballot? And for Gale, kind of the other side of that is, if there was more prior judicial review of ballot measures, would that be something that the public and citizens would see as a betterment to the process rather than a detriment, and then kind of perhaps deal with some of the cynicism of the courts, or cynicism of the voters as a result of the courts knocking them down after they'd already voted on them?
Bruno, why don't you take the first part of that?
Yes. As with disclosure, this hasn't been a big issue in Switzerland until now because there hasn't been a judicial review of the process. It has been seen as a political process, a purely political process, and the only body to invalidate a vote based on the criteria I named before, subject matter, form, and international law, was the Parliament. And it happens very seldom. But we had now in November a vote, an initiative which was proposing and putting into a constitution that in Switzerland minarets are not allowed to be built. And this has raised, of course, a lot of issues because at this moment this created the question: is this to be combined with the international obligations Switzerland has? Switzerland is a strong promoter of international law, of the European Human Rights Charter, etc., etc. So the question is, of course, at this moment, how much can that be put together? And also the question if there should be a pre-check of initiatives. And basically the Parliament should have done this role, doesn't do it. And in fact, there is a discussion now in Switzerland to introduce a constitutional court, which we don't have until now.
And most of these countries that have initiative referendum, they don't have a constitutional or court in the sense that Americans.
Yes, in fact, you have strong constitutional courts around Europe. I mean, as a result of the Second World War experience. I mean, one example is Hungary, where you have the initiative and referendum process as well, which have a pre-check of initiatives, which have in the law a very long list of excluded issues. And this creates, in fact, that out of 100 citizen initiatives in Hungary, which are checked, only about 5 are allowed for the process at all. So this shows you a little bit the problem when you have a pre-check, a judicial pre-check of the process, in fact undermining the whole potential of having citizen initiatives.
That's a great, then to jump to Gale on the wisdom of pre-review.
I'm not sure why. It may be because just the way the process developed, that we've never dealt with that in California. The fact that the Attorney General, while he does the title and summary, doesn't look at it for legal, just basic legal standing. I don't think that would be a huge problem to do. I recognize both sides of it, because if you don't like it, if you were to take something to court ahead of time and try and get it knocked out, judges are very reticent to take an initiative that has gotten signatures by the requisite number of citizens and take it off the ballot. I know of very few times that that's occurred. They really believe that that really is a better process after voters vote. So that's the difficulty is, okay, so that you go through this process, you spend a lot of money and time. It's a long process to get it to the ballot. Voters vote for it, then you litigate it, and it goes away. So I don't know why that hasn't been more salient out here. I don't think it would be a huge reform that would, throw people off. And I think it would help a lot to just have, now who would do it? And would everybody be satisfied with the attorneys who took a look at it and said, that's actually not in conformity with whatever? I don't know. But I think it's a simple thing we should consider.
Before we go to the next question, I want to jump from this to related to get a little more clarity on this topic and how it relates to the question of legislative review post-initiative. You said, Bruno, the Parliament can come in and do the invalidating. Now in this state, if something's passed by constitutional amendment, it's passed by the people. So to change that constitution, you're eventually going to go back to the people from where
and in
another.
Fact, the legislature can't touch it.
Right, and then even a statute, you have, initiative statute passes can't be changed except by another vote of the people unless there's language in it. Is that the standard? Does anyone else in the world have the rule that way, where the legislature can't really amend?
No, not in this radical way. I think in most countries where you have limitations to decisions made by the people, you would have typically the right for the legislator to make like an amendment or a change or a revision of it, and then you would possibly have the optional referendum right, which means that the people can repeal a law made by the legislator which the people feels is going against the will of the decision made before. In Switzerland, this is in fact on the side of the initiative process the even more used process, which means that 50,000 people within 100 days after a decision of the legislator can put an issue to the ballot. And this creates in fact the interesting consequence that 98% of the decisions by the legislator are not put to such a ballot, but it creates an enormous pressure on the legislator to try to find out who could be the forces who would possibly do such a referendum. And I would say this is maybe the even more important effect or impact on the political system in Switzerland, to have this optional referendum right, because it creates the necessity of the legislator to be in contact with different parts of the society to check if they are agreeing on that. So it's a minority check and balance on the legislator by this right.
The referendum is more of the dominant than type of ballot measure. Rather, we're very initiative heavy. We have all these initiatives filed, and referendums are fairly rare, 75 in the 100 years we've had them or so. You're much more, the reversal, the blocking is the more common part of the political culture.
Yes, that's a controlling function, and that's historically also the one which was most powerful in the different cantons, that the veto right of the people on legislative action was done. And the initiative, as I have said, is only about constitutional amendments, while the referendum is about legislation, statutory revision.
Is that true globally? Does the global direct democracy tend to lean more referendum, where you're passing judgment on something the legislative body does, than it does initiative?
No, globally, normally what you have globally today is basically, as a predominant feature, is on one side the mandatory referendum, which means that you changes of the constitution, membership in international organizations, change of basic laws, you have to put it to the people. And on the other side, having the initiative process, basically on the local and regional level, these are the two most important features. And this clear division between the initiative for the constitution and the referendum for the legislation, this is only done in that way in Switzerland, as I know.
Do we have other questions?
Hi, question mostly for Gale, I think. And I work a lot with consumer groups, and there's been so much criticism of the initiative process as, being overtaken by special interests. Could you comment, though, on the salutary effect of just having the possibility of initiatives out there and what it does to help us overcome special interest influence with our legislature and governor? And two initiatives come to mind. One is privacy, where Chris Larson put up $1 million and qualified an initiative after years of impasses of financial protection, financial privacy, where the legislature was so sold out they could never bring themselves to do the right thing. And the governor kept vetoing the bills. And the other is the Car Buyers Bill of Rights, that, we could never overcome the car dealer influence in the legislature, but once you had gathered the signatures, or the labor groups had gathered the signatures on that, we actually got a watered-down version through the legislature. So can you comment on?
Faint praise. Well, that was something I referenced earlier. That is something I have mixed feelings about it. Although I certainly have been involved in the use of initiatives more as a hammer to the legislature than anything else. Number one, you mentioned that it was only after we qualified the signatures that there was a bill passed related to the car buyers issue. But that cost a couple $1 million to collect those signatures. So it isn't lost on me that was also special interest money funding the other side of that. It wasn't a citizens group getting up and putting it together with volunteers. So this process that you're talking about is an expensive process, whomever is taking advantage of it. And unfortunately, in a state this size and the way the situation exists today, it is a useful mechanism, in my opinion, to force and confront certain issues that the legislature isn't working on, but it's an expensive one. And it would be nicer if it didn't have to come to that for any number of reasons.
Back.
Hi, I have two questions, one for Bruno and one for Gale. In California, we have a $200 filing fee, which you must pay prior to filing an initiative. Does Switzerland have anything comparable to that? And then for Gale, given our $200 fee, what service do you believe that fee is really carrying out, given the amount of initiatives that are filed every year?
Yeah, there's no filing fee at all. What you have to bring is, as I said before, you have to have a team of at least 7 people which are responsible, and you have to make a proposal for a text which then is translated into these other languages, so no fee.
It's an issue I've never thought about. I think the $200 filing fee is a threshold set at some point to keep some number of superfluous issues from taking up the time on the front end that I described, both the legislative analyst's shop as well as the Attorney General's shop, who do spend time putting together the title and summary and the legislative analysis. This year, what you saw happen is a number of initiatives were filed and then refiled later, as people kind of thought about them and edited them and amended them. Well, that didn't stop that process I talked about from having to go on 3 or 4 times if you submitted 4 of them. So that $200 doesn't go very far in terms of paying those costs. Why it's there, I'm guessing, but I think I'm probably right. Do you know a different reason?
I
You do actually get some service for that $200 if you want. The Legislative Council will act as your lawyer drafting it.
Who knew? See, there you go. There's your answer. The legislative analyst can be your lawyer.
$200
First.
But there's a public subsidy there, right? I mean, probably the legal advice and the time at the Attorney General's
These
office
days,
costs the taxpayers
$200
more.
gets you about what? Quarter of an hour with most lawyers I know.
Micah.
So I think it's, we passed Proposition 8, right, here in California, which is something that the legislature was not willing to do. In fact, it was more or less a rejection of the approach that the legislative branch and others had taken. And in Switzerland, is it fair to say that the minaret ban probably wouldn't have been passed through the Swiss government, but really only would have been passed through the initiative process? And what do those types of decisions say about the types of laws that get passed through direct democracy versus through representative democracy, if anything, or are they just outliers?
How about that, Bruno? Are the Swiss just very particular about architecture?
No, I mean the minaret ban thing is quite a unique proposal and a unique decision. It's part of a process. I mean, a few weeks before this vote, Muammar Gaddafi, the leader of Libya, proposed in the UN General Assembly to dissolve Switzerland, and because there's a crisis between Switzerland and Libya due to different reasons. So it was also an expression of this momentum, and obviously the government and the parties and the media had no idea. The pollsters, in fact, 1 week before the vote, projected 53% no, 37 yes, and in the end was 57 yes. So it was a very unique change. Normally initiatives which don't have a 60% approval at the start of the final phase will never make it. So this was a really an outlier, and we had about 20 votes on immigration issues in the last 20 years, and all of these votes, when it has come to the issue of not allowing people entering the country or to expel, they have all been voted down. So people basically didn't expect that vote, and it was an expression of a specific situation, but also showing a specific problem.
But come on, now, isn't there a problem for direct democracy and civil rights? I mean, there's been direct democracy in Switzerland since the 19th century, and with all that democracy, the men of Switzerland didn't see fit to vote the right of women to vote in Switzerland until 1971. I mean, doesn't that suggest that there's maybe an inherent intention here?
That's another problem. I mean, if you ask the legislator to share, I mean, if you ask a legislator to introduce direct democracy, normally it doesn't happen. If you ask the men to share the power with the women, normally that happens only after quite a lot of debate. And it's always like that those in power normally are voluntarily ready to share the power with others. That includes people who don't have a passport or whatsoever. So this has nothing to do with minorities or majorities. It's really the factor of, I mean, in 1940, when the Second World War started, direct democracy was basically abolished in Switzerland. And after the war, the legislator said, no, we don't reintroduce that. So it created a lot of people power, in fact, a pressure on the legislator to allow a new vote to reintroduce direct democracy. So this is, of course, the dilemma of democracy, that those in power, those who have the voting rights, when you ask them, do you want to share them with some other people? Normally it creates a high threshold.
What are your thoughts on civil rights and the problems of this?
In answer to your direct question, was 8 an outlier? There have been any number of issues that have gone on the ballot that I can think of that get there on an emotional or on a civil rights or on a, there's, I think the fourth time around now on parental notification is going to be on. I mean, there's certain issues that people feel very strongly about, can fund and get on the ballot. Is it directly related to the legislature's inaction? I don't think so. I think in those cases, that actually is the initiative process. Maybe it's best or it's worst, depending on where you are on the subject, but it is something where it's an extremely volatile, two-sided, close issue brought to voters for them to have their say. I may not like the result, but I do think that's the case.
One other quick point till we go to the next
Yes,
question.
I mean, in 2005, the Swiss, as the only nation worldwide, has introduced same-sex marriage by popular vote. 58% voted yes. And I would say the basic thing with direct democracy, it's like a mirror for society. So when something comes up, it's like showing where is the problem. And this not always happens when you just have a legislative process by a parliament.
Question over here.
Hi. I've got a two-part question, and it's for both Gale and Joe, related to California, recent events and pathways forward. One of the big recent stories has been the probable withdrawal of the Constitutional Convention questions from the ballot. I'm wondering, sort of from your strategic perspective, from reading the papers, it looks like that was backed to a substantial degree by the Bay Area Council, which, to read the papers, has a lot of money in it. What's the story behind them failing to come up with $2 to $3 million to put it on the ballot? And in your opinions, and also secondly, assuming it doesn't move forward, what do we do to resolve the constraints of having so many initiatives right now? Constraining what we can do budgetarily if the Constitutional Convention doesn't happen. Thank you.
I'll try. It said, was I on the record? I'll be polite. Well, I could answer that question two ways. One, something interesting did happen this time around with any number of initiatives that got submitted with the $200. And there was this sense as a practitioner that people had good ideas and they were convinced if they submitted their idea and got press that somehow the money would come. And so usually this process works best if you come up with a good idea, you spend time talking to people and making sure that you've kind of got a good idea that people are going to get behind. And part of those people you're talking about can actually fund it. And that hasn't happened with a number of initiatives for one reason or another, given the economy, given, maybe it was a good idea to a smaller group of people than you realized, or by publicizing it, the other side of the equation came forward and said, wait a minute, do you realize if you do this, this will happen? And I think in your specific instance of the Constitutional Convention, to some degree, there was a little bit of all of that going on. I mean, I kept hearing that there was at least $2 or $3 million, and by the way, since there were two of those issues, it would have been more than $2 or $3 million to qualify it, probably, but maybe, let's say, 3.5, 4, that they would have needed. And obviously, that money wasn't there. So were they hoping to raise it during the 45 window they had for title and summary? Obviously so. Not being a part of it, I don't know exactly what happened, but they either never had the money they were saying they had, or somehow people pulled away. Is that a good thing? Is that a bad thing? I think it's unfortunate if you support that issue, but that's the reality of a paid drive.
To be real specific, I did a lot of reporting on this, and I was lied to for months by these folks in Con.
That was the impolite way.
Yeah, we got $2 million. It was pledges. It wasn't in the account because you could see it wasn't that much in the account, but I was told it was there, and it clearly wasn't there. And I've received a steady stream of excuses. The creative of which are we decided to give money to Haiti. We're focused on the governor's race, and then there's sort of this veiled stuff, but nothing that I can get on the record about, claims of threats made by various interests and politicians to the very wealthy businesses and executives that sit on the Bay Area Council. But I think these guys just sort of violated the Powell doctrine of ballot initiative gathering, which is you're wasting your money if you don't go and have overwhelming force and a plan for overwhelming force going in. And while these are very smart people in a policy perspective, they were rank amateurs in terms of dealing with the initiative industry, which are sharks. But sharks with the integrity of sharks in that they want money. And if you know that going in, I think there was some drinking of their own Kool-Aid, that they were here doing, the noble thing, and that's fine. But you gotta have the money and be ready.
Wait, I have one more thing to say.
Okay.
He didn't mean me as a shark, but let me just qualify. Having said all of that, there was a lot of good debate, I think, that occurred related to the Constitutional Convention idea. But having tested it in those focus groups I was talking about all over the state, it wasn't as broad a understood and fervent movement of people and a drumbeat as you might think. It really was an idea by a group of people that might have caught on and might not. It scared a lot of voters because it was so broad that as much as they're unhappy and frustrated with the systems as it exists today, they weren't sure what it would really do or what it would really mean. And without an awful lot of work, I can say this now because it's not going to get on the ballot, I think it would have failed if it had been put on the ballot, as it was written and constituted today.
Thank you both for that. Could I just bring up again the second part of the question, which is what can, should, probably will, may be done now in the future to address the blockage of democracy that's resulted from having so many initiatives in place that constrain what the legislature
can do. I have a real fast. There is a discussion going forward, another reform that I think would be really good. That if you put something on the ballot, and it has money associated with it, you need to be able to have that money earmarked or focused on, or you have to know you can pay for it. What's going on the ballot, and there's one that's collecting signatures right now around local government transportation issues. That's another one, that I think at this point, given the budget problems we have, that would be a good reform. Beyond that, I'm not sure I have an easy answer to your question.
And that's how they do it in Switzerland, right? You that's the practice, though not the rule. You guys are responsible enough that if essentially the practice, right, is that if you're making there's a cost to what you do, there has to be the accounting for it in the ballot.
Yes, because in the Constitution there is a clause about not being allowed to make debt. So that means that when you make an initiative, you have clearly to explain how you can finance it, and if you don't do it, you have no chance to win it.
Last question.
Well, this won't count because that was my question. But just to point out that I'm wearing my Nature Conservancy shark tie, and I had a list of initiatives about debt, earmarks, funding sources, or a long list of public safety initiatives that harvested public opinion without funding sources, as examples.
Well, let's send it there. Thank you very much. I hope one last pitch for that global forum, free and open to the public, July 31st through August 4th, and you can find it on at 2010globalforum.com. Thank you to Gale, to Bruno, for all of you coming. Good day.
Thank you.